Hi guys. I know.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon on the East Coast. I don't know about how you guys slept last night. My year-old was up from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. So I've been wondering whether for a while the feeling I had in the morning was a hangover some days from a very small amount of alcohol or fatigue. And given the fact that I drank almost nothing last night, it felt like I woke up on the bad side of a bender. I can now conclude that it was fatigue. Chase, you're what? You're 6, 7 years removed from sleepless nights?
Yeah, I'd say. Well, no. When do they stop? Your brain erases everything after the first 3 years, I want to say. I think the sleeplessness I'm about 5 years out. I'm exhausted right now and fumbling because my son did decide to get up at 5 in the morning and crawl into our bed. So I'm
The
a little.
brain erasure thing, everybody tells you about it before you become a parent, that you're like, you'll ask them questions and they go, I don't remember that. And you go, how can you not remember that? And then now I have a 6-month-old and I'll be like, how did that work 2.5 years ago? Because I also can't remember. It's a pleasure to have all of you guys here. Obviously, Noah, you did not write in historical fiction. So you're here in your capacity as I think, a co-host of this podcast.
Indeed, indeed.
But we have Chase, Marjorie, and Chris gathered here. You guys have written, Chris, you write in the early 20th century. Chase and Marjorie, you guys both wrote in the latter half of the 19th century and had the pleasure of serving as an editor on each of your books. I would imagine that many of the people who are tuning into this podcast have read your books, but for those who haven't, Noah's going to give a little kickoff. And the topic of the podcast is, of course, it's kind of flowing out of some audio essays that we did recently on the stupidification, the dumbing down. There are many different ways to say it, of the state of fiction, both general fiction, genre fiction, and of course, in their kind of the loss of a place of importance of literary fiction in kind of our reading diet in America. And we're going to be having, I think, a lot of different writers on to talk about this. But the goal here was to really kick off with something that I think is one of the most important aspects of fiction and genre fiction, which is historical fiction. And I've had, like I said, the pleasure of watching each of you guys work through increasingly deep, interesting, compelling, dramatic, and insightful drafts of each of your novels. So I wanted to talk to you, and hopefully we could deliver some insights to the increasingly large listenership of this podcast. Mr. Broyles, want to kick us off?
Yeah, Marjorie, Chase, Christopher, thank you for joining us today. Brief intro to all of these fine folks. Marjorie is an author writing from Winnipeg. With Inkshare, she published The Savage Instinct back in 2021. That's a psychological thriller set in 1870s England, where a woman released from an asylum finds herself in an equally imprisoning marriage and forms a strange bond with Mary Ann Cotton, England's first female serial killer. The novel received a starred review from Publishers Weekly and was called by Booklist a fascinating portrayal of womanhood in Victorian England that is also a nail-biting thriller that will keep readers riveted until the very last page. Chase lives and writes in Los Angeles. Inkshares published his debut also back in 2021, The Loving Wrath of Eldon Quint. The story follows a Dakota farmer whose twin brother is a notorious outlaw. After years of estrangement and in violence, on a winter morning in 1883, the farmer Eldon Quint sets out to rid the world of the outlaw Jack Foss once and for all. The novel won 2 Spur Awards, Best Traditional Novel and Best First Novel, and was praised by Booklist as a clear winner for fans of Paulette Giles's Muse of the World or Charles Portis's classic True Grit. And Christopher grew up in Singapore and now lives in Canada. He's an architect by training, and he writes intricate mysteries in the Golden Age tradition. With Inkshares, he has published the standalone Unnatural Ends and the first 2 installments in the Eric Peterkin series, the most recent of which, A Pretender's Murder, was released back in February. Christopher has received wide praise, including from The Sun, the Montreal Gazette, Library Journal, Booklist, and Publishers Weekly. So all of you are masters in your respective areas of historic fiction. Very eager to hear from you today.
Yeah, what an incredible set of accolades across each of you, let alone all of you. I'm going to just briefly articulate for anyone who hasn't had an opportunity to listen to the previous 2 podcasts what kind of some of the main takeaways were and the kind of arguments proffered, so to speak. And then we can dive into the questions. I think at the core of what we were talking about in the audio essays was first and foremost a loss of attention span. books require a tremendous amount of focus, both in obviously bringing the words to life in your head and the attention span for masticating something across, intellectually and emotionally across 8, 10, 12, 16, however many hours. It asks things of you that nonstop television, video games, social media, and perhaps even podcasts don't. So, I think, addition to that, we have just a general fracturing of our attention. It's allocated across so many more things that books themselves don't occupy that place of primacy. And in addition to that, like a lot of what we've talked about in the audio essays is the loss of thinking, right? And the prevalence of feeling that it's not just that we've stopped reading, but that the things that we're reading don't ask us to contemplate the fundamental richness of the human experience. It's all entertainment, and so much of it is nothing but titillation. Mr. Broyles, what else would you add in addition to that?
No, yeah, that's a good summation of the last two. I think pulling from my audio essay a couple weeks ago was kind of just this mass proliferation of forms of entertainment has led in fiction, I think, to almost a hyperbole in so many genres. Where to have your voice heard as an author these days, you need to be shouting the loudest in a sense, and the fiction that shouts the loudest doesn't always say the most. So yeah, I think we're looking to plumb the depths of where the happy medium is between saying something but also entertaining your audience at the same time.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, just to kind of like add a little bit to that, like I have never thought, and it's certainly something that you guys know because we've had an opportunity to work with each of you guys. There's nothing wrong with entertaining people in a book. You know, I think like a book doesn't need to feel like homework. I've never picked up one of Christopher's books, except for the first drafts, of course. No, I'm kidding, Chris. It's never homework. And felt like his rendering of human frailty came at the cost of the quality of the rendering of that human framing. And that's one of the questions that we want to get into. But that when you settle for only entertaining, and that when the term entertaining really comes to mean titillating, that one of the great things that a book can give you, which is to put you in someone else's mind and experiences, loses a lot of its value. So let's dive into that. And then Noah is going to do a dramatic reading of the first 5 chapters of A Court of Thorns and Roses after this. Maybe we can start with you, Marjorie. What's your favorite piece of historical fiction from another writer, whether it's recent or it's a bit ago? For each of you, I don't think that anyone embarks upon the process of writing historical fiction without having appreciated a piece of historical fiction. For almost everyone, you're in some sense trying on a version of or making a contribution to a genre that you love. So, who was it for you? What was it for you?
Yeah. Well, actually, before I started writing The Savage Instinct, my favorite piece was the Wolf Hall series by Hilary Mantel.
Who recently passed, right?
Yes, but I knew that that wasn't really the kind of thing I wanted to write. It's so intricately researched. It's a study of one man and his kind of passage to kind of notoriety and fame. I sort of had another author in mind who was also a favorite at the time, Sarah Waters, who wrote several historical fiction pieces, Fingersmith, The Little Stranger, which was a big inspiration to me because it's historical, but it's sort of a psychological horror almost. And in that book, there's such a slow burning sense of dread that I thought this is the kind of suspense story that I want to write. Something that's rich in character, but that has this overwhelmingly dark atmosphere. I don't know whether you know that book, The Little Stranger. I know it was made into a movie, and it's the story of a man from a working class background that is introduced to this big, sort of stately home and becomes, as a child, but becomes obsessed by it and goes back to it as a adult and a doctor. And it's crumbling by that time. It's a sort of crumbling kind of gothic place. But Sarah Waters is able to um, entertain you, but also make you think. about so many aspects of the human condition. And there were some other books of hers that I really loved. And when I'd read those, I thought that's the kind of effect that I'm going for, the sort of sweet spot between depth and character development, but also this amazing sense of atmosphere and sort of darkness, sort of dread. So I would say she was a major inspiration to me, as well as Margaret Atwood with Alias Grace. That was another
Of course,
big
something we
one.
talked about a lot. Chris, who
Yeah.
was it for you? Chris, yours is actually, I mean, it's a bit peculiar perhaps because your form of fiction is actually something that was obviously, I think, largely contemporaneous, right? In the sense of your
It wasn't historical when it was written.
yes, that's exactly right.
It's kind of hard to say what my favorite thing was because I've want to read so much. I remember being very fond of Anthony Trollope's Barsetshire series in the Eric Peterkin Mysteries. Eric lives in a place called Barchester, which is very much a reference to that. But that was mostly because of the author's narrative voice. I've heard him described as uh, third person omniscient and chatty. Because he'll tell you what's going on, what he thinks is going on, what you should think is going on, how you should feel about it, and then he'll go on to the next thing. It's really incredible. The stuff in the period that I'm writing, all the Agatha Christie's and so on and so forth, Father Brown and so on. Yeah, that was all contemporary at the time. It's really hard to pick just one. No, I mean
Do you
when
have
I
a favorite, Christy? Is there one
Mm,
that stands even, a forehead above the rest?
I was just thinking about it this morning. I think I have three which really come to the top of my mind. Five Little Pigs, A Murder is Announced, and Mrs. McGinty's Dead.
Chase, what was it for you? Because you had a very strange genesis point.
Yeah, I tripped into it, I guess you could say. There was an image in my mind and it felt old and it felt I could feel a certain time and a place and it wasn't a place or a time that I'd ever really been attracted to before. Which is actually, I'd say that's probably the thematic through line with my writing is I often go into worlds that I don't know enough about, both from a genre perspective, writing in genres that I don't really particularly understand, which has its benefits and its drawbacks. The benefit being, tend not to lean on tropes or established rules of a genre, and the downside is that I tend not to know the tropes or the established rules of the genre, or just not how the genre functions. So it can be a bit of kicking around in the dark, and that was the same for writing a Western. And I liked Westerns and read some books and, I was aware of the genre, but it wasn't something that I aspired to write in. And then as far as historical fiction, I just sit and think about this as Chris and Marjorie were describing the books that they really loved and the reasons they love them. Because for me, I don't know if I have that same affinity for it, but there's a book I'm reading right now that's called what is it? Kalima Tales, I think. It's by a Russian writer named Varlam Shalamov, I believe is how you pronounce it. And poor Varlam was in the Gulag for about 15 years from the mid 1930s. And he writes this, I guess you'd call it documentary fiction, because he's writing about his own experience, but they're very much stories, and he gives the stories a shape. And I think what I really like about this book is it's a number of just short stories, or even there's a story about a tree that rises in the summer and then will sort of lay itself down in the winter, knowing that the snow is coming. So it's very much about nature and and humanity, and I think you'd see that if you read The Loving Wrath of Eldon Quint. There's a lot of that in there. Maybe that's the attraction there.
Had you read a lot of Westerns before you went into it, or was it something that
No,
you then
I
really
mean a
had to?
few. Yeah, a few. I think I'd read Lonesome Dove and oh god, the name of the book is escaping me. The Searchers, which I don't remember. I remember that was the name of the book or just the name of the movie. The Alan LeMay and a few others. I want to say, but no, I didn't. And then, in the writing process, I did. I just read anything I could get my hands on for whatever purpose I needed it at that time. And not more of it was just filling my brain with it, using it for the moment, and then it falling right back out the other side. Which just tends to be the process for me when writing. I'm just sort of consuming anything I can get my hands on, but that stuff isn't necessarily sticking beyond, the what I need it for at that moment.
Let me
Yeah.
ask you guys this. We obviously have been having this conversation about like what's gone wrong, I think, in the content that we consume, um, in terms of like, what comprises the literary diet today. And it's almost impossible to have that conversation without having a conversation about the broader kind of cultural corpus in America, right? Because what people write and what people read is a function of that. I had texted Noah at midnight or 12:30 in the morning the other night because I had been listening to a podcast while bottle feeding my younger child, and I had been surprised to hear critique of Herodotus in his Historiae, right? His telling of the histories of the various regions of the ancient world. I mean, I learned two things. One thing that I took away was I didn't know that the word historia, our word history, comes from his title Historiae, which actually means the researches in Greek, which I thought was interesting. But I was also interested to find out that people had really critiqued him for his kind of overuse of violence and his overuse of sex and scandal and all of these things. And it made me chuckle to think of how this kind of critique of an over fascination and reliance on titillation and these just base instincts literally goes back to the Iron Age and presumably even well before then. So this stuff is so just clearly endemic to our repeating cycle of how we interact with serious and non-serious writing. Marjorie, we would go back to you. Where do you think we are in our fiction diet today?
Yeah, I went on to write a few contemporary suspense thrillers, which did quite well, but the pressure from editors and publishers in that space, because psychological thrillers are very popular now, the pressure is they want you to write, and I'm going to quote, an unputdownable, absolutely gripping thriller with a jaw-dropping twist. This is the kind of thing they're asking you to do. So often what they're asking you is to do something at the expense of developing the characters, making the plot move really fast, coming up with twists that readers will never figure out in advance, even though they're not really plausible twists. I've found that has been a pressure for me, but I still continued to write books where I felt I couldn't resist developing the characters more, going into their lives a bit more, their motivations. And what happened with the first couple of books that came out, when they first came out, the readers, some of them were saying, "Oh, this is a really slow burn. I can't get into this," because it wasn't the kind of wham bam start that they were used to. But gradually, I found an audience who really wanted that more in depth, sort of almost, I guess they call it upmarket suspense, which sort of straddles the boundaries. But it was a bit of a tough thing to get there. But now I'm kind of feeling that there is a bit more of a pressure to write something with less depth, something more like a sort of an ensemble mystery, like I don't really want to mention names, but kind of Lucy Foley writes good examples of that kind of thing, where you throw a bunch of people together and a murder happens. I think it's sort of trending to be more plot driven than character dense, but there are still some pretty good contemporary suspense writers out there that I enjoy, but many of the bestsellers at the top of the like New York Times list are written by a select few people who are basically pumping out the same kind of suspense, you know, two a year maybe.
Chris, I want to get your characterization. We've had a lot of global conflict. We're inundated constantly with news updates on our phones, and we're stressed out and we're anxious. And what people want is just fun. The world is so serious, and because that seriousness is brought to us in 1,000 headlines and push notifications a day. Is this now a permanent state that we live in where books are just network television of like disposable, repeatable plots with thin characters and some, big plot point twist or whatever that's going to bring you back from the commercial 5 times an hour? Or do you think we're going to have a moment at which we go, hey, this really isn't working, and we just have to leave our phones on do not disturb for the whole day and return to reading more serious things? It may not be as stark and binary as that, but which of those do you tend towards?
I'm I'm actually not sure that the issue is quite as dire as you think it is. I think there's a certain survivorship bias that's at play here, that we've always had dumb entertainment, all the sex and violence from the Iron Age. It's just carried through. We've had these penny dreadfuls that were all the rage, when they came out, and nowadays we don't really remember any of it. I mean, Sweeney Todd and maybe Spring-Heeled Jack, I think, may still be in the public consciousness, but you don't really remember. You don't really remember. You don't really remember the dumb stuff. So when you look back at the stuff that survives, you think, that period must have been really, really smart, but not really. You're still looking back at a period where people may have enjoyed, public hangings,
Mhm.
bear baiting, gladiatorial combat, and I feel like that in every age, people are always looking at the current literature and comparing it unfavorably to what happened in the past. I think that whatever's going to quote unquote save this age is going to be people looking back from maybe 2 or 3 ages in the future, saying, "Oh wow, the early 21st century, they were so smart."
I hear you. I mean, your argument, which I heard a few days ago for the first time, is essentially that there's a positive survivorship bias in the sense that the kind of disposable stuff doesn't stick with us, right? And the stuff that sticks with us is the more substantive stuff. So that you're going to look back on, the first quarter century, nobody's really going to remember A Court of Thorns and Roses or whichever romantasy novel of the
Or
week, month, or year
or
it
they
is,
might for different
or they might.
for a completely different reason. Because another thing I think is that some so-called dumb things actually turn out to be a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So it's both that certain things that might be viewed as stupid in one age take on a subsequent meaning in another age, right? And similarly, that just the more meretricious disposable fiction doesn't have a staying power. So you'll look back and things like The Goldfinch will have a more pronounced resonance in retrospect, or things like All the Light You Cannot See, which has obviously been a big book, or The Covenant of Water, or any of these books that are on the more serious side will have a disproportionate share of our retrospective recollection, either 20 years from now in our lifetimes or 100 years from now. The most obvious thing to say about this, maybe it's not the most obvious, but one obvious thing to say is that I believe Gatsby was a critical failure in Fitzgerald's lifetime,
Mhm.
that he died and it had sold fewer than 5,000 units. And so I think that there's, at the very least, a heck of a lot of anecdotal evidence in support of this hypothesis. Chase, let me ask you a subset of this question that I've had kicking around in my head for the last week. Each of you is a great novelist. Each of you is also an incredible screenwriter. Uh, Chase, you've obviously had some big sales that, you're entering the WGA. Marjorie, I've read your work, both kind of in, a Microsoft Word file and in Final Draft. It's fantastic. And Chris, you and I have had a lot of opportunities to work together on the adaptation of your book, including with the very big director in John East. Chase, there's this weird thing right now where, and maybe it's always been true, but books were for a long time, I think, the predominant creative engine of our society. Reading drove Hollywood, right? It's not to say that there weren't plenty of spec screenplays that became gigantic hits. Of course there were, right? But reading felt like the fundamental kind of literary creative lens. And I think somewhere in the past 20 years, it really flipped, which isn't to say that people didn't love going to the movie theater before. but reading really was the primary form of cheap, portable, premium entertainment, hopefully premium entertainment. And that seems to have shifted a lot, where we really are no longer a society that reads, we're a society that watches. And I think that the thing about things that you watch is that they cost a lot of money to make. And because of that, they are so much more of a team effort. There's so much less of a function of an individual person. There's a much greater phalanx of executives that are modifying things. And there's often just so many individual writers that are brought in on a project. So that it's much less of, setting aside the word author for a second, it's much less of an auteur medium, right? You could say that film itself is much less of an auteur medium than it was in the late 90s, for instance, but just it's much more of a group corporate effort than the book, where it is just much more of an, I think, an expression of a unique individual's perspective on how to tell a specific story. Do you think that kind of film becoming the dominant expressive lens, TV with it, of our society has reduced the role of the author auteur as like a singular storytelling, yeah, singular storyteller in a way that tends to make things dumber? Does that resonate at all for you?
Yes, it does. But also, I don't know if, well, one, I don't know if film and TV are the dominant medium anymore. I think there's an argument to be made that, anything under 30 seconds is the dominant medium. And as far as the individual creator versus the committee, I don't know if Hollywood has essentially changed its ways. I would say that in the 90s, there was as many sort of committee built projects, like a movie like The Fugitive, for example, which, probably had 7 or 8 screenwriters on it, where, it's not because they would hire somebody and then they'd fire them. It was actually more because yes, it was like not everybody's great at everything, and they would bring somebody in to write, do a dialogue polish or do this or do that. But a lot of the times, the really good people are only available for 1 or 2 drafts, and then they go off and leave the producer with a script that's not greenlightable. And then they have to go and hire another writer, and then that writer's probably maybe of a lesser caliber or not quite right, and then they have to hire another and another and another. So it's often it's a function of the marketplace that exists around the business and availability and whatnot. And I guess what I'm just saying is there are all these different factors that go into why movie is successful or not, or if it feels like it has an authorship to it, or it feels like something that was made by committee, something that, clearly there's no through line. The voice is muddled. As far as where those projects start, whether from, what is just referred to by the blanket term of IP, I'd say IP is as prevalent, if not more so than
Yeah.
ever, but it's not just books. It's graphic novels, it's webtoons, it could be anything, a children's book. All of us with kids have probably maybe read some version of the Pout Pout Fish to our children. Maybe you and I, Adam, are the ones that's our
If
age,
you
and
had
they're
to
making.
translate IP into a phrase, because we obviously hear this word all the time, what do you think it usually means?
Well, I don't know if it has any meaning anymore, because what a lot of people are doing is creating the IP to then make the movie, which is, IP, I think, inherently is something that was a creator of value in a different format. Now it's just a different format, and maybe it was successful, maybe it's not. Obviously, it would always help for something to be successful.
I mean, you could logically decompose the term IP, which obviously, I mean, people mean intellectual property when they say that. And I've always thought, having heard it a million times over all of our time in Los Angeles, that it is a certain point like Hollywood wanting to don the linguistic attire of more serious industries. But I think that, you could say that it brings an audience with it, right? That it's something that people recognize that they're attached to, which means you have some presumptive viewership coming into your investment. To you could say that and this is connected to that it's a form of validation, that you have something that you can look at and you could say mechanically this works, and then you can look at it and you can even adjacent to that say that it's some type of schematic. We're not starting from zero. We have access into the minds of these characters that will inform screenwriters, directors, and actors, amongst all the other sundry coterie of individuals that participate in the making of a television show or a movie. But let me ask you guys this, kind of from your perspective in the process of writing these books. What is it that you think that if we're talking about an age in which things may or may not be, as Christopher asserts, uniquely dumb, right? What do you think, irrespective of the validity of that hypothesis or partial validity of that hypothesis, why is historical fiction smart? And why does it give something that is above the norm in intelligence to a reader? What are the various aspects of that?
I think part of it is relating the past to the present and sort of revealing that certain things are universal, certain things continue to enthrall us throughout the ages. And because what that does is it kind of speaks to a universal human truth. So if there's something that something about the past that resonates with you, it still resonates now, then that gives it even more depth. Going back to the whole idea of fun versus depth, my personal thought always is that having depth without the fun is a false depth, because what the fun actually is that it's an appeal to the human psyche. If humanity in general doesn't find any appeal in what you're writing, then there's a very real possibility that you're not connecting with the human truth. And if you're not connecting with the human truth, then what depth do you really have?
That's interesting. There's nothing inherently wrong or degrading about an aspect of a story being entertaining in some regard. It's something that really, though, you said that strikes me as true and something I've thought about a lot in editing historical fiction is that there's I think, an innate human desire to situate ourselves in a lineage, right? And to connect with the past and to see ourselves not just in kind of the context of our family and, those that came before us in a kind of our ancestral, narrowly defined lineage, but to see the fears, the wants, the needs, the hopes, and aspirations of humanity as constant across both history and also just different countries, civilizations. That feeling of sameness, I think, is the opposite of almost hyper consciousness and then super individualization, where you kind of achieve a sort of peace and knowing that you're kind of the teeny tiniest thread in this larger, fairly common human fabric. Does that kind of is the thing that I just said what you were thinking?
The other thing is the difference. I mean, it's a similarity and the difference to that even though these circumstances have changed, even though this technology has changed, you're still dealing with something that is fundamentally the same.
I want to take that and flip it into a question that will bring Chase into this conversation. The point is obviously that it doesn't just give us an insight into the past, right? But that it gives us like a little bit of an insight into the present. The frontier is closed by more or less 1890, right? But Westerns really begin 10, 20 years later. And yes, during the period of the West, you have the dime store generic novels that maybe Christopher is referencing as a certain sense. Those are the types of things that don't survive. But there's something about the Western that it is this tale that we use to tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about the making of the American nation. And because of that, there's something about so many of them that are there's an intentional dictation of a narrative. And then, more recently with certain revisionist Westerns, we've seen an intentional telling of an opposing narrative. So I'm just curious for you, if we're talking about historical fiction makes us smarter, do you think that there's something unique about many of the great Westerns in the fact that they are also narratives about kind of the birth and building of our nation?
Well, let me try to knit those two. So, historical fiction making us smarter, but also the Western myth, which is divided into the myth and then the revision of the myth. I mean, I think I'm sure there are other genres that have this inherent tension in a sort of polarity to them, like the Western does. I can't think of them right off the bat, but I'm sure they exist, where it starts out as one story and then that story is retold often from the alternative perspective to illuminate the, for lack of a better word, bullshit that was inherent in the first version, the myth making. I think that, that gave Westerns probably a second life, and I'm not sure they have a third life in them. I think what's interesting about the Western, many things, but for me, what was interesting was that tension between the myth and then the destruction of the myth. I just always found that. I think that was the attraction for me, was the same attraction to maybe reading the Bible. And the Bible was written. Many of the stories in the Bible are written 150 years after the actual occurrences. And I think if you look at enough crazy TikTok videos, you'll start going back to ancient Sumeria.
Certainly.
But that idea of looking back, I mean, all of history. I mean, maybe the thing that I'm trying to articulate here is that all of history is fiction, right? It's always being told through the lens of looking backwards, generally through the voices that survived it and want to shape it to their benefit, right? So history itself is whether it's considered fiction or actual fiction, is all some sort of narrative designed to tell a story that isn't necessarily the truth, or is going to leave out certain things that benefit the teller of the history.
If you begin with this kind of like Hegelian notion of there's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and then those are synthesized together, you have the kind of initial myth making of the American West. Then you have an intentional unbundling, evisceration, counter narrative, however you want to state it, that's proposed. And then in your novel, I think, for instance, you're certainly not the only novel to do this, but it is something of an attempt to balance those two things, to acknowledge that there is an unqualified and ineluctable savagery to the kind of quote unquote settling of the American West, but also that the overwhelming majority of people that went out there were themselves impoverished, destitute, broken people simply trying to establish something better than the hardscrabble poverty of either the country they came from, number one, or number two, the East Coast that they found themselves in, which had no sanitation, famine, disease. The people that were sent out there were pitiful and pitiable, right? And that those two narratives could sit by side.
I think what you're saying, and if you go to you're talking about holding two potentially opposing ideas,
Yeah, the thing that we hate doing today, right?
same
Yeah.
in the same breath, and which is I forget who proffered that as their definition of intelligence, but can people do that still in a world where we're sort of always being coerced or cajoled into choosing a side? And a
Yes.
Western is inevitably about, many of the pre-revisionist Westerns are, Indians are bad and, settlers are good, or vice versa. And so, it becomes this us versus them narrative. And then the revisionist portions start looking at, start picking that apart. So I guess if you were going to, look at how the Western could challenge us to, engage our critical thinking skills, it would be looking at those different sides of the coin and coming up with assumptions about them that don't necessarily fit the prevailing narratives on either side. We've maybe not lost. I mean, the skill of many people can do this, and it's talked about all the time. And I think we talk about how dumb we are in very smart ways today, ironically.
There's some aspect that, and having to engage with these notions of the past. Here's an argument, here's another argument, and not an argument in the sense of like you're given a political essay to read, but the various characters and their experiences as humanized on the page by the writer give you a human insight into people. Marjorie, there were so many times in the editing of your book that I kept saying, Marjorie, there's a problem. She doesn't leave. She's beginning to realize the person she's with is terrible and she doesn't do anything about it. And you would go, well, she can't do anything. And I would go, well, what do you mean she can't do anything? And over the course of editing that book, like the kind of bringing home, not like a intellectual understanding of powerlessness, but an emotional understanding of powerlessness, because across these drafts of empathizing with this character, you begin to live in this world. Christopher, in your book, it deals with both issues of kind of race relations and war trauma, and having to dig into those things, and also kind of economic and class conflicts. It makes you think about so many things from back then versus today, even the degree to which things like technology are beginning to upset the manner in which people interact with each other, because the telephone is this new dandy thing, right? Don't you think that there is something about having, and I don't think it's like a baseline level of having to do your homework, right? Because the person that does the homework is the author. But to go back to critical thinking, right? If the thing that we're losing in our fiction is thinking, do you think there's a degree, each of you, to which reading something that is set in the past kind of carries with it a baseline intrinsic level of critical thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful drawing together of what we've been saying, I think, in that if like the thinking that we do in our contemporary fiction is naturally blinded by our contemporary circumstances, which it seems to be we've been saying with all of this discussion of history and historical fiction, then the only form of fiction that really lets us step outside of ourselves and outside of the time of ourselves is historical fiction. And so I think The Road Home may well be the historical fiction novels that we'll see either. Many of the thinking person's fiction novels that you mentioned earlier, Adam, All the Light We Cannot See, Covenant of Water, they're all historical fiction novels. So part of recognizing where we are and maybe trying to nudge our way towards somewhere else will probably be achieved through the lens of historical fiction.
I don't think it's the only genre, though. See, and I'm always drawn towards science fiction and speculative fiction. And I've been reading a lot of stuff that I think that is also an area where you have to really think, which requires a lot of critical thinking, which requires a lot of research, because on something, some phenomena, something real is happening now. And I do believe that's why my favorite writer, Margaret Atwood, kind of transitioned into science fiction and dystopian fiction. I think that's definitely an area where, you step outside of everything and consider the possibilities of what if this happened or what if that happened, and especially when you're thinking of some of the current trends today, the AI thing, it's limitless, really, what you can come up with. And I think that's a really hopeful area. I've read some really good pieces of work that are pushing the boundaries, and I think that's an area that's going to save the thinking person's fiction.
Chase, you had a thought there.
Well, I was just going to say it's a great point about, world building, essentially novels that are forced to build out
Yeah.
a whole world. And I'm always amazed by writers who can do a series of books like Dune or even Game of Thrones, right? But what's interesting about those books is that they're creating this whole other world. But I want to say it was Game of Thrones that is based very heavily on a certain period of history in the Middle East,
Mm.
1,000 or so years ago. And Dune probably being very much based on just colonialism in general, and the myth the religion that is used to control the people. So all those things have touch points in history, even though they're creating a world that is a little foreign to us, but there's still something that we can grab onto and go, this feels, we're still living in the human space with so many of those books. Those are big epic, and they don't have to be big and epic. Anything can, you can build a world that feels very small but intricate and detailed. And yeah, I think I was having kind of a problem wrapping my mind around this book or this idea of books that make you think, or the author has to do the thinking, or something that is more than just tropey crap, like the stuff you were describing, Marjorie, that publishers would like you to make, which is formulaic nonsense. That in the form requires the author to dig deeper, I guess, where maybe that's the problem we're experiencing today, is the form is encouraging the author to stay on the surface, whether it's publishers who want the same kind of thriller over and over again with minor differences, or the supposed Netflix decree that for a large majority of the filmmakers, they need them to constantly engage the audience and be giving the audience those dopamine hits. So, while they're folding laundry, they occasionally will look up at the television. So, maybe it's the formats it's the sort of the circle, the recursive circle, where we're giving people kind of dumber stuff. That's what they have to watch. They're half paying attention to it, and then we have to get dumber to make them pay more attention to it.
Let me try and encapsulate it, a couple things that you were saying, and then It's fascinating, right? Because as Noah made that comment about historical fiction being the way that we do that, I could hear kind of like Tal Klein in my head, who wrote the Punch Escrow, is a great friend of mine, kind of go, well, you can do the same thing in the future. And obviously that's what Marjorie said. I think we all agree with that, and so does Noah. I think at the core of that is this notion that in some way it's easier to contemplate our own questions and existence and feelings and nature in an environment that feels completely removed from our present. When you remove all the constants, or what environmentally, right? It's easier to kind of understand and access certain things, right? Which I think it makes sense that everyone can kind of think their way into why seeing things in a completely foreign context allow you to look at it distinctly and understand it more precisely. Marjorie, you were bringing up certain types of fiction before. I actually, I don't like, I don't know how different that is from some of the things that we're dealing with from Danielle Steele. I think Danielle Steele has a lot less staying power 10, 20, 30, 40 years removed from the height of her fiction, which would go to Christopher's point. But the thing that Chase was just saying that I think is interesting in kind of setting up that dichotomy is that, like, listen, there's always been a market for these kind of stories that keep people on the surface of something, right? That don't let you go deeper. Like they used to be in the mass market paperback. It was a small paperback with small print. They were disposable. They were $3.99 or $2.99 or later $4, $5, $6.99, but they were cheaper, right? And the reason that the reason that it was called the mass market paperback was that it had a mass market. It wasn't called the small market paperback, right? There was a huge audience for that. So just like by the name of the format, we can simply infer that there was always a big audience. Chase, the thing that what you were saying that made me really think, and the question that I would ask each of you in kind of concluding here is there is like a smart version of everything and there's a dumb version of everything, right? And a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are aspiring writers. I think that the overwhelming majority of the people that are, I think we have our first episode now over about 1,000 downloads, which is wonderful. And I would bet that like 650 of those downloads are aspiring writers, people in the larger Inkshares audience, most of whom we've never met or interacted with. But to conclude this conversation with a question to each of you, right? There's a really smart version of everything, and there's a really dumb version of everything. The dumb version of the Western is some version of the dime store, kind of like shoot Indian, rob stagecoach, drink whiskey, kiss girl, just that kind of lather, rinse, repeat, gym tan laundry, right? Uh, the much more interesting, compelling version of it, I think, is to try and get into the humanity of the various people that kind of archetypally define the West, right? And to try to, in doing that, get under the skin of the American story. Christopher, for you, you've done so much to use the murder mystery to ask ourselves questions about society and really focus on motive in a really deep way. It's never just murder for the sake of a murder. It's a murder as driven by humanity, and that humanity is influenced by society and the mores and norms of that society in all three of your books. The opposite of that, I think the dumb version is essentially, like I always say with Noah, it's like the wordle of death, where it's just like a puzzle, right? That is played for no other purpose than can I get the clues together faster than the person who's also reading the book at the same time? And while that may stave off dementia and keep the mind nimble, it's not going, it's not enriching us, right, in the context of self-understanding, understanding of humanity, and our view of the world. Marjorie, for you, it's in a certain sense like one could simply take all of the like the facets, right, of the kind of type of story that you're talking about as derivative, meretricious, formulaic, tropey, and you could simply pop that into history and give it the thinnest AI enhanced gloss of period history, and it would be completely meretricious. Whereas a better version of that, which is unequivocally what you accomplished in your novel, and the reason you've received a lot of critical praise for it and audience praise, is that you can have aspects of a story that fulfill a desire for plot and not fun, because like watching a woman slowly gaslit leave isn't, but you can have a story that has aspects of danger and aspects of all of this stuff. And in a certain sense, the thrill of spending time with Mary Ann Cotton, England's first female serial killer. And you can also leverage that to talk about really important concepts that bring you into the life of someone 150 years ago or so, while also enriching our understanding of the present. And I guess I would say to each of you guys, whether or not the aspiring writer that's listening to this is focused on historical fiction, or maybe like you were saying, Marjorie, it's a different type of universe that allows us to contemplate our existence, or maybe it's just written in a present we recognize. Do you have any advice? Like, what would your advice to that writer be on engaging with the story that they're developing in a way that maximizes its intelligence without necessarily making it homework for a reader?
I think for me, the first step was to find a personal connection. When I find a personal connection to something, I can buy into it. Obviously, the story, Savage Instinct, had a personal connection because I was from the area that the murderer was born. I knew the kind of people that lived there. I lived that life around those people because my grandmother lived there. So that connection kind of got me into it at first. Once I started researching it, if you're going to write historic fiction that really works well, you have to be prepared to delve into the past by, in my case, looking at newspapers from the era. I think that's the best way to actually understand the psyche and the lifestyle of the times. Newspapers are amazing sources of everything from what people used for medicine, what people did for entertainment, how people felt about social issues, the actual language of the time. And once I started getting into all that, reading accounts of, Mary Ann Cotton's one of the very first pieces I read from a newspaper at the time was the account of Mary Ann Cotton's hanging. And it was so chilling. It read like a piece of fiction. It was so descriptive. It had such atmosphere, but it was really disturbing. But looking at newspapers for me was a way to immerse myself in the era because obviously you can't go back and interview people from that era. So reading a lot of firsthand information is the best thing to do. And once you're really immersed in it and you're thinking that way, you know how the people speak. And I had an advantage there because I'd come from that area and I had an idea of how people lived and spoke. I don't think you can write something with real authenticity until you've done all of that research, I would say.
You're kind of saying, I think, number one, finding a piece of the character that you can get into an emotional understand and from a dramatic perspective to seed it with real humanity. Like some people use themselves, some people use people they know, right? The second thing that you said was that you have to do the research. You have to find things that allow you to get into this mindset,
Mhm.
but they also give you specificity, I think, and reality. And in both of those things that you said, drawing from oneself or someone that somebody knows or doing the historical research, what you're looking for, I think, is authenticity. Chris, what do you think keeps a young aspiring writer, irrespective of genre? What is your advice on
I think you're muted, Chris. You're
Chris? You're still
muted,
muted.
Christopher.
Still muted.
He might be telling us the most brilliant thing in the world right now.
He
It's
is.
unbelievable.
Denied it.
We just lost it.
Yeah,
Chris, we can't hear you.
we can't hear you. You're muted.
My apologies.
Smartest guy in the podcast can't find the unmute button.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many things, and Marjorie's already talked about doing your research. But I guess I would go one step further and say to just open your eyes and pay attention to the world around you. In A Gentleman's Murder, there were a bunch of things that um I just that are just injected into the setting based on what I happened to see on a visit to the south of England. There's a church, for instance, there's a church with a facade that's faced in flint. And I remember when I first saw a flint wall, I had no idea what it was. I thought that they built a wall out of the bones of a whale or something like that, but it was flint. Someone explained it to me, and I saw a lot of it all across that area of the world. And of course, I had to put that in, and that just enriches your setting. It grounds you in the place where you are, and it lends a sort of authenticity to to your writing, your setting, and where you are in the world in it. Just small things, the color of the sea when you're in that particular part of the world where you've set your story. Uh, you know, what the sky looks like. I know that in Singapore, there was a lot of cloud cover. One of the things I noticed moving from Singapore to Canada was how different the sky was. So that those are things that you can
Yeah.
small little things that you just inject into your novel and to enrich the sense of being there.
One of the great gifts of spending time with you is you have an architect's eye. You see everything, right? But that the world is a fascinating place. And there are things all around us, whether you're sitting on a bus, that we ought not, as creatives, forget to simply do the research of observing the world we live in and being fascinated by things and noticing things. I bet if you asked people 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago to describe the color of the sky on any given day, then you ask people today, we have an extremely diminished capacity to actually tell people what the world looks like around us. And I think that that's really interesting. Noah fell off. I'm not sure where he went, but one of the things that we talk about a lot, and Chase, you and I have had an opportunity to discuss this, is that what will novels look like in the future, right? When the people that are writing them were raised on this their whole lives, that so much of a novel comes from a place of boredom. And this means you're never bored, right? Do we have to just take 100,000 kids and raise them in the woods with no phones and to identify one that might be a Cormac McCarthy? Obviously, we're not going to do that, but it's an important question. But Chris, I love your point of don't forget to do the research of looking at the world around you and bringing even those kind of what we shouldn't think of as quotidian, but perhaps we think of as quotidian details in to build the narrative dream. And Chase, what is it for you? What's your advice to a young writer in the sense of, I'm trying to remember how old you were when you started writing your first novel. You're in your mid 30s?
I was in my mid, maybe. Let's see. Yeah, 20. I would have been about 36.
And you had started writing maybe 5 years before that, 6 years before that as a screenwriter. Is that right? Your late 20s, you kind of began to go like, maybe I'm a writer.
Yeah, mid to late 20s. Uh, Came to it later then, I guess.
And you're having a level of success now, I think professionally, both in your book and now in your screenwriting. That is something that for years, I think you really dreamed of being able to work on both successful books, big projects. When you look back at the things that drove you toward really smart fiction, because if I looked at all the different things that you do in your writing, there really feels to be um, a level of research in all of them, whether it's a deep military thriller screenplay that requires you to talk to people who have been through SOF, whether it's a Western. What is it that draws you to these very specific research driven worlds? And what's the advice coming from that experience that you'd give to a writer today?
Well, I think Marjorie and Chris gave, you know, just fantastic advice. But let me give an additional perspective, which is, yeah, look at the world around you, look backwards, but also look inside yourself. Because I think the for me, the function of the research is to, I think if any project I've written that's been successful, at least to me, it's because I had something to say. And then I started going out into the world and looking for ways to challenge that thing that I thought I was talking about. And then, the whole process to me is, if you're a writer, you're sort of like Dr. Frankenstein, and you're putting this monster together, and, you've got a limb and you've got this, you've got that. And eventually it starts to look like a human form, but the heart isn't quite beating yet. And you're looking for that little lightning strike that's gonna, set the body aflame and, have it stand up and start talking to you and being this living, breathing thing. So ultimately, the whole process is the hunt for that thing, and you have to both go inside yourself. And then, when I was writing Eldon, I was trying to, at the very beginning, when I was just trying to think of names of characters, and names are always really important to me to sort of get right. I started walking through graveyards and looking at people who died in that area, in that era, and who lived, and just sort of getting a sense of that, same as Chris's sort of flint wall in a way of just like being in a place and feeling it. Those are all really, really fantastic things to do. But for me, it always has to start from some question or something about the human condition. And I think ultimately the last thing I'll say is smart is we've been talking about smart and dumb, but I think there's the whole that sort of leaves out the real reason I like to read fiction and write fiction, which is the feeling, the emotion, the human connection, the unveiling of some mystery within myself that I find is also within everybody else. That insight into the human condition that was not clear to me until that moment. So I think something being smart is we're tangling all that up in that word, but really for me it's something having an impact, something having a true emotional resonance to me. And that's not all stories don't need to do that. Stories can be really satisfying without having some sort of grand insight into the human condition. But to me, that's that's what I'm looking for. And I don't always find it, but that's, I think, the thing that I'm searching for, that thing that's going to, make the monster stand up and smile and feel the sun on their face.
Yeah.
I would
Somebody
say,
go ahead.
look for that. Yeah.
Somebody once said to me, write from a place of discomfort.
I'm
I'm
always
not,
doing that.
Hey, we're gonna break. Chase, you said something a moment ago that really made me think. Obviously, everyone said a lot of things that are very thought-inducing and thought-provoking. But at the kind of the core of what you were saying was that the word smart and dumb can mean a lot of things, right? And maybe in retrospect, we should have begun this pod by asking people to decompose what those words mean. So maybe we should do a couple quick lightning rounds. If I said the word smart to you, what are the first 2 or 3 words that come to mind, and kind of breaking that down into more precise component parts?
Mm. It's funny because in the way that I've been thinking about it, it's almost pejorative. Because in Hollywood, smart is something that people will a term people will throw around. Oh, this is so smart. And I feel like, oh, it's cold and lifeless and has like some twists. So yeah, yeah. So it's almost embedded in my mind as that. And intelligent, I think, has a slightly different connotation than smart, which also I think is pejorative in Hollywood. Things can be too smart or too intelligent like that. Yeah, I think those are the words that were floating around my head. But I know that's not. I think the intention of how you meant them.
Yeah, but do you have
Something that feels original, subversive, irreverent. Those are the things that I find, you know.
okay, I like it. Original, subversive, irreverent. Marjorie?
smart, satirical, out of the box, edgy, insightful, wise.
Chris?
Smart, it's like when you get salt in your eye. Okay, not really. I, if you're talking about synonyms, intelligent, aware, I guess, would be a very big thing. Being aware of what you're doing, aware of what you're saying, what it means, and not taking things for granted. One of the big things about tropes, I think, is when people just throw a trope in without thinking about what the trope means. So overall, I think a big part of smart is understanding the truth behind the tropes, why the trope exists, why it works, and not applying them willy-nilly without understanding.
Thank you all for being so generous with your time. You're just superlative role models to all the aspiring writers.